eyes. They weren't black, but they were nonetheless large, very minimal nose, and a slit-like mouth with no lips. And that's a very strange detail for someone to come up with if they were describing a sexy female figure, which some skeptics have accused VS-Boas of doing. So that's just one. There are others, beings seen by the roadside that have this certain character where you read it now, looking back on, decades now of watching gray-like aliens being the expected alien. When you see a flying saucer on television, the mental image is that it's filled with these little spindly, gray, big-headed, big-eyed aliens. That's just become what we expect. But it's not necessarily a modern phenomenon to expect aliens to look like this. The template, the gray anatomy, seems to recur going back quite a long time. And that makes me wonder if there is something to it, if it's more than just a metaphor, or more than just a kind of a science fictional caricature for something that we're not otherwise able to address. So the grays there seems to be some validity to that. Now, they are very minimal, and that very minimalism makes me rather suspect that the grays are a literal interpretation of what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. It could be a simplified. The human mind tends to focus on the most prevalent details. In this case, the eyes and the lack of a mouth and the very minimal nostrils, and the lack of sometimes clothing. Just the very bare, Spartan appearance of these beings suggests that they are, in a certain sense, kind of caricatures. Maybe embellished or by our imaginations, but that doesn't mean that we're not seeing anything. So,
I've always thought the grays were like robots, man.
Yes, they're described. Well, it's strange because depending on who you speak to, some people describe them in very stridently robotic terms. They describe them as behaving as machines, moving in lockstep, and then other people describe them as very compassionate and very warm, giving creatures, which is kind of the opposite of robotic. So not having seen one personally, I couldn't offer really any particular insight on that, other than that there seems to be a more or less coherent picture of these beings, kind of a composite portrait of these beings as kind of impoverished, sickly, frail. Whether that means they are sickly or frail, I don't know, but they appear that way to us. One thing that I think is intriguing to note is that the grays would seem to be ideal astronauts. If we are indeed dealing with entities from another planet or entities that have grown to occupy very resource-scarce habitats, then this very spindly physique would be quite ideal, because it would entail that they don't use much, they don't eat much, that their physical demands are very few compared to ours. So in that sense, maybe there are robots or genetically engineered or bred to be like this. And that begs the question of what they want with us. If they're aliens, what good is DNA for them? I mean, you could always argue that alien anthropologists would have an inherent interest in our genetic structure because of the novelty involved. If we met aliens on Mars, for example, we'd probably want to take DNA samples, see what they were made of and find out if there was a common ancestry, and et cetera. But you have all these accounts of bedroom abductions with kind of a sexual implication, and it's all rather creepy and sensationalistic. But it also begs the question that are we genetically compatible with these beings?
Sure, it is bizarre. It is bizarre.
No, it's absolutely bizarre. It's quite alarming, and I think there is a genuine signal in there. I think there's lots of noise, sure, but there's noise with any inquiry, and I think we're dealing with a physical, something that can be physical. It might not be entirely physical, but we hear lots of accounts of they're interdimensional travelers, and that's an interesting idea. But what's that really mean?
Throughout this entire planet, we are getting millions of people who claim to be abducted. It was coming up at a barbecue I went to this weekend. They were asking me if I believed it, and I said, I haven't experienced it, but there are a lot of people with credibility who have truly felt and believe that they've been abducted by these extraterrestrials or these creatures or entities, whatever they may be. And sure, some of this may be made up. Some of this may be part of the brain. Some of this could be mental illness. But then there could be these cases that are actually bona fide. They're happening to these people. But it's happening worldwide, Mac. And that, to me, is truly incredible.
Yeah, not as incredible as it would be if we lacked a global media infrastructure. But it's still fascinating. There was a case in Zimbabwe where the people saw these entities, and they described them in culturally relevant terms. In other words, they didn't describe them as aliens from outer space, which is what a typical American would say after seeing these things. They described them as the ghosts of their ancestors. But yet they described the prototypical gray alien wearing silvery suits, riding in these metallic objects. So I find that very, very interesting. And a question that arises to me is, well, they described them in distinctly different cultural terms. The context was different. But is one term necessarily even more valid than the other? To us, they're extraterrestrials. To the people in Zimbabwe, they were spiritual entities. Maybe neither explanation, neither interpretation is accurate. Maybe we're dealing with something different. It might seem naive or whatever, even primitive to think, they're spiritual entities, ghosts of ancestors. Yeah, right, whatever. They were aliens, and that's a very typical Western response, I would suppose. But just because we think we have the answer, and it might seem perfectly logical, well, we're dealing with beings from another star system, visiting us for whatever purposes, nefarious or otherwise. But I think this is an opportunity to look at this phenomenon in a more humbling light, and to recognize that perhaps we don't have the answer. Perhaps the extraterrestrial hypothesis, despite its prevalence, despite its seeming logic, and there is a certain logic to it. I mean, if we were to continue exploring space, we would probably visit other planets, and eventually, like in Star Trek or a good science fiction novel, we're going to encounter another species. And I would predict that would indeed happen if we were allowed to roam the galaxy like these alleged extraterrestrials seem to be able to. But
as you mentioned, though,
yeah.
the big case of Barney and Betty Hill seemed to push this to the forefront, put it into the light. Look, Magazine did a story on them, and it truly began to become an incredible story that so many people read about and heard about. Yet, this alien-human hybridization program seems to be ongoing. David Jacobs thinks there's something wrong here, something evil behind some of this. How about you?
I don't see anything necessarily evil going on. I've read Jacobs' work, and I find it fascinating, but I can't help but wonder if we're dealing with something. I guess I'm returning to something I said earlier, that we're dealing with something that's so beyond our neurological hardwiring that we're unable to address it, that we're unable to perceive it. I mean, we evolved in a very compromised environment. Our brains are essentially fancy, organic hazard avoidance machines. They're made, they're wired to perceive patterns quickly before the person gets killed by a marauding animal or whatever, or clubbed to death by a fellow human being. And from a certain outlook, our brains are not terribly sophisticated. So what would an intelligence so beyond us look like? How would we perceive it? It might fall into the basic domain of the quintessential psychedelic experience. And I think there is an interesting congruence between accounts of people who take doses of LSD or DMT.
Or magic mushrooms. Or
magic mushrooms like Graham Hancock has done, like Terence McKenna has done, or Daniel Pinchbeck. And they report back with reports of these strange bug-like creatures sometimes, not always. But here's an avenue for research. Here's something that we could possibly even test in a laboratory, and this has been done to a limited extent. But I would recommend that this would be done more aggressively, because if we are dealing with a phenomenon that has decided implications for consciousness itself, the fact that we would be able to isolate a certain chemical compound, in the case of DMT, something that's secreted naturally by the brain, that's really exciting. And if we could make some sort of breakthrough Of course, that's all very speculative, but it's not entirely impossible. And if there is a terrestrial connection, if we are dealing with beings that evolved right here on Earth and share the same essential chemical makeup, that would... I guess a question I would have is, do these beings use DMT? Are they able to access realms of reality that would seem fanciful or even mythological to us because of access to a certain chemical? So that's a question that remains unresolved.
We'll be back. We'll talk more about this, Mac, and also we'll get into your other work after the Martian apocalypse. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.